In this video, we are going to look at the final issues arising, which is how compatible is utilitarianism with a religious approach to ethics. Now, what we're going to do is look at Buddhism and Christianity separately. So we'll start with Christian ethics. And it's important to realise that Christianity is a massive religion and that it's changing. You can see from its demographics that 2/3 of Christians were European in 1910, but that's down to only a quarter now. Again, if you look at this map, here are 11 countries that are home to half of all the world's Christians, and again it's important to note that Britain does not feature on that map. That means that your experience of Christianity, which is mostly going to be Anglicanism in this country, is not representative. To see that in a different way, you can look at an Orthodox church in Moscow, which looks kind of a little bit like Disney World crossed with a mosque, as beautiful as it is. You can see in the top right someone being crucified to celebrate Easter in the Philippines. This is unlikely to happen at Ripon Cathedral. And in the bottom two images, again, you can see an Orthodox church with all its finery and beauty and a Trucker's Chapel in Texas. The interesting thing is that the people in the Trucker's Chapel probably would consider the extravagance of the ceremony in the bottom left picture to be immoral and not acceptable and somehow unchristian. And likewise, I imagine that some of the people who are enjoying the Easter festival in the Orthodox Church would look at the simplicity and, dare I say, crudity of the Trucker's Chapel and see that as somehow not appropriate. The point I'm trying to make here is that Christianity is a multifaceted and diverse religion, and so any attempt to summarise Christian ethics will be pretty reductive. That being said, there are several sources of moral authority that all Christians would recognise that they share in common. The difference between the different denominations, or Christian groups, is that they place different emphasis on these sources of moral authority. All Christians would be united in the belief that Jesus Christ is the example for individual Christians to follow and for the Christian community as a whole to follow. They would also say that the Bible has a special place in any Christian life and that prayer also is a crucial way of forming ethical decisions. Protestants in particular emphasise the importance of following the Bible verbatim because they reject more formalised versions of church teachings. This is called sola scriptura and was part of Martin Luther's original Reformation. Modern Protestant groups, for example the Quakers, place a huge emphasis on prayer and the Holy Spirit. They're represented by a stained glass window with a dove in it, as a way of making moral decisions. Quakers would say that parts of the Bible could be dismissed as irrelevant in modern culture. Other Protestants would say that you can't dismiss any part of the Bible and that every aspect of it is literally true. The final two pictures show the Church of England Synod, which is an area where the Church of England gather to create church teachings, and the Pope, who is emblematic of the idea within Roman Catholicism that the Church produces a set body of teaching and has a clear hierarchical structure that can tell people how to behave and which acts are deemed to be moral and immoral. We need to see if these sources of moral authority can be seen to point in the same direction as utilitarianism. So let's look at the example of Jesus. On the one hand, he says, "Don't think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them," which suggests that he has a commitment to legalistic ethics, which would be a big problem for utilitarians. He also says, "Father, take this cup of suffering away from me," when he's facing his crucifixion, "but not what I will, but what you will." This shows clearly that he understands the crucifixion will be a painful process that he does not want to do, and yet he's willing to subordinate his will to God's plan. This suggests that he is not looking at general happiness as a director for his actions. Rather, he's looking at conforming with God's will. And again, this seems to be a deontological approach rather than a consequentialist, utilitarian, hedonistic approach. And yet the crucifixion of Jesus does seem to be an example of utilitarian thinking. Remember, he's killed so that everyone who believes in him will not be killed, but have eternal life. This seems to suggest that one person dying, one innocent person dying, is good because he saves the rest of humanity. That seems to be quite confusing. Not least because when this issue arises itself in the New Testament, it seems to get slapped down as immoral by the Gospel writers. So if we look at the incident involving Caiaphas, the high priest, he orders Jesus to be executed because, and I've put it in bold here, he says, "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." Caiaphas is seen as a fundamentally immoral guy for saying this because he's willing to kill an innocent person for the sake of the greater good. Utilitarian thought is rejected. And yet you could argue that that's the very basis, the very foundation of the importance of the crucifixion. It'd be controversial, many people would disagree with you, but you could argue that, and you could certainly do so in the exam. There are other aspects of the example of Jesus that seem to coincide with utilitarian ethical decision-making. For instance, the Pharisaic Judaism that was popular at the time had very strict rules about what you could do on the Sabbath day and what you couldn't, and we can see that these are still in evidence in Orthodox Judaism now. Jesus breaks these rules quite a lot, and when he's challenged about it, he says, "Remember, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." That means he's putting people first and rules second. Also, he's given the opportunity to throw the first stone at someone who has committed adultery. He's asked to ceremonially begin an execution. In the Bible, there's no suggestion that the woman is innocent. She seems to genuinely have committed adultery. She's cheated on her husband with another man. But Jesus refuses this honour, which is actually a trap by his enemies, but he refuses this honour and says, no, 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 anyone who hasn't committed a sin, you get to throw the first stone. This seems to be him putting forward love or compassion as a purpose behind ethical activity, and not simply the following of rules. Now, this doesn't coincide exactly with utilitarianism, but it does point to a rejection of deontological thinking and a rejection of legalism, which is utilitarian. And that's recognised by John Stuart Mill, who says that the golden rule, which is to treat others as you wish to be treated, is the complete spirit of the ethics of utility. For John Stuart Mill, utilitarianism and the core idea in Jesus' ethical teachings were compatible. However, if we look at the Bible, we can see that the issue becomes a little bit more confusing still. If we reject the idea that there are absolute moral laws that apply in all places at all times, we are going to have a confusing relationship with the Mosaic 10 Commandments. How can those 10 Commandments be commandments if they are instead mere ethical principles that can be discarded as and when, as the context or situation demands? It would fundamentally change our understanding of what a commandment is. It would also fundamentally alter our conception of who God is. For a Christian, a God is the ultimate law giver. He decides what is right and wrong on earth, and this applies in all places at all times. If there are no rules, if there are no laws, God can't be that ultimate law giver. And so God is denuded, is stripped of that key aspect of the divinity. We can look at this line in James, which says, "Who are you to judge your neighbour?" Because only God gets to do the judging. Well, according to the systematic approach of utilitarianism, you are entitled to judge your neighbour. That's kind of what it means if we are going to judge each situation based on its consequences and its context. There is no overriding moral authority. Neighbours have to judge neighbours. Neighbours have to act that way. That is the core of ethical decision making. And again, we have this quote from Jesus in Matthew's Gospel that says, I've not come to change the law. I've not come to abolish it, but actually to enforce it. Probably the best example of how utilitarian ethical decision making is not compatible with certain types of Christian ethical decision making can be found in Catholic Church teaching. The Catechism, which is a book of teaching and rules about ethical behaviour, by its very definition is pretty legalistic. It says there are some things you simply can do and some things you simply can't do. And the Catholic Church is really clear that the end does not justify the means. You can't break minor moral rules to secure a greater moral good. That is immoral. You can't do bad actions and justify them by saying that the purpose of it is good. And yet that is the whole point of utilitarianism. The whole idea is that there are no minor goods or bads, but there is the one overriding principle that we are trying to create the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Catholicism has a whole host of minor rules that you aren't allowed to break, from the Ten Commandments, which are obviously in Exodus, to something like the Seven Deadly Sins, which evolves in church teachings during the Middle Ages. Lust is just wrong. Wrath is just wrong. Pride is just wrong. It doesn't matter what end goal we can use to justify wrathful or envious actions. They are wrong, just immoral. And again, this cannot be seen as compatible with utilitarianism in any way. So, to evaluate, then, it's compatible because the golden rule is similar to Mill's rule utilitarianism and the no harm principle. Jesus himself often rejected strict rules and their application, and in many dilemmas, the responses that a Christian ethicist would arrive at and a weak rule utilitarian or rule utilitarian would arrive at seem to be the same. So they often arrive at very similar conclusions. And Jesus did die for everyone, and that does sound a little bit utilitarian. Many Christians will argue against that, but again, it's a justifiable point. The incompatible list is a little bit longer. God is supposed to be the universal lawgiver. If utilitarianism is true, then he can't be the universal lawgiver, because there aren't universal laws. The Ten Commandments are obviously meant to be universal rules, but they can't be if utilitarianism is to be accepted. Jesus didn't seek pleasure, like in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he asks God, please take this cup of suffering away from me, but if you don't, then I will ultimately obey your word. And we have to follow Jesus's example, and his example isn't hedonistic. Jesus didn't seem to want to abolish laws. I know that's contradictory to something we've got in the compatible column, but this is a fact. He does seem to say that rules aren't that important, and then he directly says that rules are important. There is a seeming contradiction there. That's fine. Catholic ethics value intention, not just consequence. It's important that you try and act in a morally justifiable way. And Catholic ethics actually say that if you do a good thing for a bad reason, it deletes the good merit that you can expect to get in heaven. You've had your reward, as Jesus says. You've had your reward. So acting, even doing a good act, but with a poor or bad intention, it negates the good that the act does in God's eyes. But Catholic ethics also say that ends don't justify the means. So you can't do bad things and hope that your good intention makes that okay. It won't. So if we look at Buddhism now, the same point's going to apply that I made about Christianity. It's an incredibly diverse religion, but there are some fundamental points that we can make here. The first is that in Buddhism, the important thing is to identify suffering. And avoiding suffering is really, really important. And that sounds a lot like negative utilitarianism, that you should seek to eliminate suffering from your life. An uncharitable understanding of nirvana, with its concept of the dissolution of the self, could be seen as the painless destruction of all sentient beings that Smart warned us about. So you could, and I think it's quite a clever point, see Buddhism as an early prototype of negative utilitarianism. However, there are also areas where it's not compatible. For instance, in Buddhist ethics, motivation is seen as absolutely essential. So a good act is one that has a good motive. And it's the motivation rather than the consequences that decide whether an act is good or bad. However, that is not the case in utilitarianism. In fact, it's the opposite. Motivations are irrelevant, whereas consequences are vital. In Buddhism, though, the 5 precepts are basic guiding principles. They're not overly restrictive laws. In fairness, there are incredibly restrictive laws for the monastic community, but the laity tend to have guiding principles, and that seems roughly similar to utilitarianism, although it's debatable how strong an argument that is. Buddhist ethics, I think, are inseparable from the beliefs about karma and nirvana and samsara, the worldview that's contained in Buddhism and their ethics, that they're inseparable. And utilitarianism couldn't care any less about nirvana or samsara or karma. And so that seems to be an area where the ideas aren't compatible. Buddhism can't be separated from its worldview, whereas utilitarianism has no time for that worldview, would probably see it as superstitious nonsense. And Buddhism seeks to avoid craving and gain awareness. They're its ultimate goals, and to end suffering, whereas utilitarianism is all about pleasure. And so the end goals, the purposes of these ethical systems don't seem compatible. So, final evaluation. Negative utilitarianism and Buddhism seem very similar. Nirvana sounds a lot like Smart's unintended consequence. The precepts are guides, not overly prescriptive laws, and it's incompatible because intention is vital in Buddhism, but irrelevant in utilitarianism. Beliefs in karma, samsara, nirvana, etc. are foundational in Buddhist ethics, but not mentioned at all in utilitarianism. And Buddhism is about awakening and awareness and the avoidance of suffering, not pleasure, which is what utilitarianism is all about. Finally, have a look at this past paper and the mark scheme. Again, hopefully you'll see that the content that's going to be required in the exam isn't too scary.